western Pyrenees, where the damp night air smells of crushed pine needles, wet ferns, and ancient, rich earth, there exists a profound biological anomaly that has puzzled hematologists, geneticists, and historians for nearly a century. In this isolated, rugged pocket of the world, nestled stubbornly between the modern borders of France and Spain, the local population possesses the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood on the entire planet. To understand the strangeness of this, we must look at the microscopic landscape of the human body. The vast majority of the global population carries a specific protein known as the D antigen on the surface of their red blood cells. If you have this microscopic marker, your blood type is classified as Rh positive. If you lack it, you are Rh negative. Worldwide, only about 15% of humans lack this protein. But among the Basque people in these deep, shadowing valleys, that number skyrockets. Furthermore, they possess an exceptionally high frequency of the O blood type. This is not a matter of folklore or cultural myth. This is a cold, hard, objective, medical reality. It is a silent, invisible signature of an incredibly isolated lineage, a biological fingerprint written into the very architecture of their veins, suggesting a people who simply did not mix with the sweeping tides of humanity that washed over the rest of the continent. What if I told you that the story of European civilization, as it is often written in standard textbooks, a neat, uniform progression of agriculturalists in bronze-wielding empires sweeping from the eastern steppes, seamlessly overriding and replacing everything in their path, is fundamentally incomplete? What if I told you that there is a surviving remnant, a living, breathing echo of an older, vanished world, hiding right in plain sight among the jagged peaks of Western Europe? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So, get comfortable, maybe subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Whether you are settling into the dark in Boston, watching the quiet streetlights flicker in Paris, or listening to the rain fall against the glass in Amsterdam, the night is the same everywhere, offering a quiet, still space to simply listen. 50 million years ago, long before the concept of blood types, language, or humanity itself, the earth beneath this region was engaged in a slow, grinding, and unimaginably powerful violence. The Iberian Peninsula, which was essentially a massive island of continental crust, drifted relentlessly northward, driven by the deep, subterranean thermal currents of the Earth's mantle. It eventually collided with the massive Eurasian plate. This collision did not happen in a day, or a year, or even a millennium. It was a slow-motion crushing of solid rock that lasted for millions of years. The immense pressure of these two tectonic plates colliding forced the ancient seabed to buckle, fold, and thrust violently upward into the sky. Marine limestone, formed by the microscopic shells of countless ancient sea creatures falling to the ocean floor over eons, was pushed thousands of meters into the air. This tectonic upheaval created the Pyrenees, a massive, jagged spine of stone stretching over 400 kilometers from the turbulent, gray, saltwater expanse of the Bay of Biscay in the west to the calm, azure shores of the Mediterranean in the east. The western edge of this mountain range, the ancestral homeland of the Basque people, is distinct in its geography. It is not characterized by the sheer, impassable, oxygen-starved alpine altitudes of the central peaks. Instead, it is a chaotic, folded labyrinth of deep, steep-sided valleys, plunging ravines, and a complex network of limestone ridges. It is a landscape that is profoundly vertical. To move from one valley to the next is not a matter of simply walking across a plain. It requires navigating treacherous inclines, navigating dense, shadowy forests of oak, chestnut, and beech, and finding narrow passes that are easily choked by winter snows or sudden, blinding fogs. The Bay of Biscay acts as a massive, perpetual weather engine for this region. Dark, moisture-laden clouds roll in off the cold Atlantic Ocean, pushed by prevailing winds. When these heavy clouds hit the sudden, rising wall of the Western Pyrenees, they are forced upward. As the air rises, it cools rapidly, unable to hold its moisture, resulting in relentless, heavy, life-giving rainfall. This constant precipitation has carved the limestone over millions of years, creating a karst landscape, a sponge-like world of deep subterranean caves, underground rivers, and massive sinkholes. The water acts as a slow chisel, eroding the rock drop by drop, century by century, above ground. This continuous rain creates an environment of explosive, vibrant green. The valleys are thick with vegetation, creating a stark, startling contrast to the arid, sun-baked plains of central Spain, just to the south. This specific combination of steep, folding terrain, dense forests, and relentless weather created a natural, formidable fortress. It was a fortress not built of stone blocks, hoisted by human hands, nor defended by constructed walls or watchtowers, but a fortress carved by water and time. For early human populations, geography is destiny. When a landscape is incredibly difficult to traverse, people tend to stay where they are. They build their lives in the deep valleys, turning their focus inward rather than outward. Over generations, centuries, and millennia, this extreme geographical isolation exerts a profound pressure on human biology. In the study of genetics, there is a concept known as genetic drift, often accelerated by endogamy, the practice of marrying strictly within one's own local community. When a population is locked within a geographic fortress, separated by steep ravines and treacherous weather from neighboring groups, the gene pool becomes a closed system. The external world, with its massive migrations, its shifting empires, and its mingling of bloodlines, simply passes by the foot of the mountains, deterred by the sheer physical effort required to penetrate the high valleys. Inside the fortress, the genetic markers of the founding population are magnified and preserved. The high concentration of Rh negative blood and type O blood among the Basque people is the biological echo of this extreme, enduring isolation. Their bodies became a living archive of a time before the great mixing of European populations, preserved by the physical walls of their environment. When we look at the jagged ridges of the Western Pyrenees silhouetted against the night sky, we are not just looking at rock and earth. We are looking at a massive geological mechanism that dictated the survival and the very cellular makeup of a people. The deep valleys held them safe. The steep passes kept the outside world at bay, and the mountains themselves stood as silent, imposing guardians over the centuries. It is a profound reminder of how the physical earth dictates the flow of human history, shaping our blood, our movements, and our survival, silently trapping time within the unyielding weight of stone. As the frost hardens the earth and the high passes of the Pyrenees succumb to the impassable snowdrifts of deep winter, a profound and heavy silence settles over the valleys. The outer world is entirely cut off, leaving only the smoke rising from the chimneys of the isolated, heavy-timbered farmhouses, known as the Basque. Within the thick stone walls of these ancestral homes, beside the radiating heat of the hearth, a sound vibrates through the air that defies the fundamental established laws of human migration and linguistic evolution. It is a language known to its speakers as Euskara. To hear it spoken is not merely to encounter a different dialect or a regional variation of a familiar tongue. It is to listen to an acoustic fossil, a surviving audio transmission from an epoch so impossibly distant that it predates the very concept of written history. To grasp the sheer, baffling improbability of Euskara's survival, one must zoom out and look at the linguistic map of the globe, stretching from the lush, humid subcontinent of India all the way to the windswept green coasts of Ireland. Across this massive, sprawling expanse of the Eurasian landmass, nearly every single language spoken today belongs to a single, dominant, conquering family, known as Indo-European. Whether you are listening to the rhythmic cadence of Hindi in the streets of Mumbai, the sharp, precise consonants of German in Berlin, the rolling vowels of Spanish in Madrid, or the familiar structure of English, you are hearing the divergent branches of the exact same ancient root. Thousands of years ago, a wave of nomadic pastoralists swept out of the Pontic Caspian steppe, carrying with them the ancestors of these languages. Like an invisible, relentless tide, their words, their grammar, and their syntax washed over the continents, entirely replacing, absorbing, or eradicating the native voices that existed before them. Yet, against the sheer, overwhelming pressure of this linguistic tsunami, the Western Pyrenees held fast. When the wave of Indo-European languages crashed against the limestone ridges and deep ravines of the Basque country, it shattered and receded, leaving the indigenous tongue completely intact. Today, linguists classify Euskara as a language isolate. This is a cold, clinical term that carries a profound weight. It means that despite decades of rigorous scientific analysis, supercomputing algorithms, tracing phonetics, and relentless comparative studies, Euskara has absolutely no demonstrable genealogical relationship with any other known living language on the face of the earth. It is a complete evolutionary orphan. It sits alone on its own solitary branch of the human family tree, surrounded by a forest of Indo-European giants, a remnant of a prehistoric linguistic landscape that has otherwise been wiped entirely clean from the surface of the planet. The architecture of this language is fundamentally alien to the structures we are accustomed to in the modern Western world. If you examine the grammatical mechanics of English or French, you will find a nominative, accusative system, a method of organizing thought that is heavily focused on the doer of an action and the object being acted upon. Euskara operates on a completely different paradigm of human cognition. It is what linguists call an ergative absolutive language. In this intricate, ancient system, the subject of an intransitive verb, someone who is simply existing, resting, or experiencing a state of being, is treated grammatically identically to the object of a transitive verb. It places a profound, subtle emphasis on the state of the subject, creating a worldview encoded into the very syntax of the mind that values the inherent condition of things over the mere execution of violent or active force. It is a way of mapping reality that feels distinctly ancient. prioritizing the landscape of existence over the assertion of dominance. Furthermore, Euskara is heavily agglutinative. Rather than relying on separate prepositions, pronouns, and auxiliary verbs floating loosely in a sentence, Euskara builds meaning by stacking suffixes onto a root word, one after another, like geological strata accumulating over millennia. A single, densely packed word in Basque can express an entire, complex sentence in English. It is a language of extreme efficiency and crystalline precision, requiring a mental agility that seamlessly weaves multiple layers of context, time, and relationship into a single, continuous exhalation of breath. The speaker does not simply arrange words. They construct intricate, mathematical towers of meaning, building upon a foundation that has not shifted since the massive continental ice sheets began their slow retreat. To listen to native speakers conversing in a dimly lit tavern in San Sebastian, or like a village square in Navarre, is to hear a rhythmic, percussive music. Euskara features a highly distinct phonology, characterized by a complex system of sibilants, where English might have one or two variations of a nasal sound. Basque utilizes a precise, tripartite system of hissing consonants. There are sounds articulated with the very tip of the tongue, and distinctly different sounds articulated with the flat blade of the tongue pressed flat against the alveolar ridge. It includes sharply trilled R's and palatalized consonants that give the spoken word a sharp, crisp texture, resembling the sound of a fast-moving stream cutting through a bed of polished, river-worn gravel. It is a phonetic inventory that demands strict muscular precision, a physical shaping of the mouth that has been meticulously preserved from one generation to the next. This meticulous preservation is even more astonishing when one considers the extreme physical fragmentation within the language itself. Because the topography of the Basque country is so incredibly divided by those steep, impassable ravines and heavily forested ridges, the language did not historically develop as a single, uniform monolith. Instead, it fractured into highly localized, hyper-specific dialects. Historically, a shepherd living in a valley, just 20 miles away from another, might speak a version of Euskara so distinctly different in its vowel shifts and vocabulary that mutual comprehension was a genuine, daily struggle. The geographical fortress that kept the outside world at bay also locked the internal populations into their own isolated microenvironments. Yet, despite this extreme internal division, the core structural integrity of the language, the ancient underlying mathematical code of its grammar, never dissolved. It simply adapted, branching out like the deep, twisting roots of an ancient oak tree, gripping a rocky cliff face, unmoving and unbreakable against the wind. But perhaps the most staggering objective reality of Euskara lies hidden within its most basic, everyday vocabulary. The specific phonetic combinations used to describe the mundane, practical tools of human survival. When a Basque speaker today refers to a knife, they use the word aisto. When they speak of an axe, they say aiskora. When they mention a hoe, the word is aitzur. To the untrained ear, these are simply nouns, labels for metal tools hanging in a shed or resting in a kitchen drawer. But to the etymologist, they are a breathtaking window into the deep, unfathomable past. All of these words share a common, defining root: heights. In Euskara, heights means stone. This is not a poetic coincidence or a modern fabrication. It is a genuine linguistic fossil. The vocabulary of the modern modern Basque people still carries the heavy, undeniable imprint of the Stone Age. Before the advent of metallurgy, before bronze and iron were pulled from the dark earth and forged in blinding fire, the ancestors of the Basque people were naming their world based on the lithic technology they held in their cold hands. They named their cutting tools after the flint and chert they meticulously chipped from the riverbeds and cavern walls. As centuries bled into millennia and the rest of the European continent adopted new technologies and entirely new Indo-European languages to describe them, the Basque people simply adapted their ancient words to the new materials. They held on to the root of stone, even as the blades turned to bronze, then to iron, and finally to modern steel. They are, quite literally, speaking the vocabulary of the Paleolithic era in the modern digital age. We often think of history as something profoundly solid, something we can dig out of the ground, measure in carbon isotopes, or touch behind the polished, temperature-controlled glass cases of national museums. We look for shattered pottery shards, rusted, oxidized spearheads, and the crumbling, vine-choked foundations of lost cities to tell us who we were and where we came from. But the most resilient artifacts of human existence do not cast a shadow. They weigh absolutely nothing. They are constructed entirely of vibrating air and human memory. Spoken words are invisible architectures, passed continuously from lung to lung, from parent to child, in an unbroken, terribly fragile chain across thousands upon thousands of years. They carry the exact breath of ancestors through the crushing, silent weight of time, proving that sometimes the most enduring monument a people can build is simply the sound of their own voice, refusing to be silenced by the turning of the earth. 20,000 years ago, the northern hemisphere was locked in a brutal, planetary-scale chokehold of freezing temperatures. The orbital mechanics of the Earth, the minute, almost imperceptible variations in its axial tilt, and the subtle shifting of its elliptical path around the sun, had slowly drawn the planet away from optimal solar radiation. This seemingly microscopic shift in cosmic geometry triggered a cascading climatological collapse across the globe, initiating what geologists and paleoclimatologists objectively record as the last glacial maximum. Across the sprawling landmass that we now classify as Europe, a colossal, terrifying mechanism of ice was expanding. The Fennoscandian ice sheet, a continuous, crushing expanse of frozen water, grew to unimaginable proportions. It was not merely a thick layer of winter snow. It was a continental glacier, in some places over 2 miles thick. The sheer, incomprehensible mass of this ice physically deformed the Earth's crust, pressing the continental bedrock downward under trillions of tons of frozen, unyielding weight. This advancing wall of ice obliterated everything in its path. It scraped away ancient soils, decimated established forests, and flattened valleys, replacing the vibrant, temperate ecosystem of the continent with a blinding, sterile, and highly lethal wasteland. Because so much of the planet's atmospheric water was trapped within these monumental, static glaciers, global sea levels plummeted by more than 400 feet. The coastlines of the world expanded outward, exposing vast, barren continental shelves that had previously been submerged. The winds that howled off the face of the European ice sheet were fundamentally different from the breezes we know today. They were katabatic winds, dense, gravity-driven currents of air, supercooled by the massive glaciers, carrying a flesh-destroying chill across the open plains. The sprawling forests of oak, elm, and birch were entirely annihilated, replaced by the mammoth steppe, a dry, freezing expanse of hardy grasses, mosses, and lichens that stretched unbroken from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the eastern edges of Siberia. For the scattered, fragile bands of anatomically modern humans living across the European continent, this was an apocalyptic extinction event. They could not fight the changing atmosphere. They could not negotiate with the advancing glaciers. They were faced with a binary biological imperative: migrate or perish. As the killing cold pushed inexorably southward, human populations were funneled into a few scattered geographic pockets where unique microclimates offered a narrow, unforgiving margin of survival. The most significant and heavily populated of these sanctuaries was the Franco-Cantabrian Refuge. This specific geographical zone, hugging the shores of the Bay of Biscay and sheltered by the towering limestone spine of the Pyrenees and the Cantabrian Mountains, became a critical sanctuary for human continuity. The ocean, though significantly colder than modern standards, acted as a massive thermal battery, absorbing faint solar radiation and moderating the extreme, sudden drops in temperature. The deep, jagged valleys of the Pyrenees, the exact same valleys that would later protect the Basque language from Indo-European erasure, functioned as a monumental physical windbreak against the lethal katabatic gales sweeping down from the northern ice fields. Within this confined refuge, the ancestors of the Basque people, alongside other European hunter-gatherers, were pushed to the absolute limits of mammalian endurance. The human body is inherently a tropical organism. We are largely hairless, entirely prone to rapid heat loss through convection and conduction, and completely reliant on our metabolism to maintain a strict core temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. When the ambient temperature drops consistently below freezing, the body engages in a desperate, microscopic war for survival. Blood vessels in the extremities constrict violently, sacrificing the circulation in the fingers, toes, and superficial skin layers to keep the vital organs, the heart, lungs, and brain, functioning, to prevent their flesh from necrotizing in the sub-zero air. These early humans had to master complex thermal engineering. Survival was no longer just about hunting. It was about the meticulous, exhausting management of calories and insulation. They relied heavily on the massive herds of reindeer, ibex, and steppe bison that migrated through the tundra. But killing the animal was only the first step in a hyper-efficient economy of survival. Using finely knapped flint tools, they systematically dismantled the carcasses. They extracted the nutrient-dense marrow from the bones, a vital source of fat required to keep their own metabolisms burning hotly enough to stave off hypothermia. They utilized tiny, delicate needles carved from slivers of animal bone, threading them with dried animal sinew to stitch together highly tailored, multi-layered garments of fur and hide. A poorly stitched seam, a single gap, allowing a draft of glacial air to reach the skin, could be a fatal error in calculation. However, tailored clothing alone was not enough to withstand the deepest, darkest months of the Ice Age winter. To survive the absolute, freezing extremes, humanity had to retreat into the earth itself. The karst landscape of the Pyrenees and Cantabria, honeycombed with deep, subterranean limestone caves carved by ancient underground rivers, offered a stable, geothermal sanctuary. While the surface world was a freezing, wind-scoured hellscape, the deep recesses of these caves maintained a constant, predictable temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was within these lightless, silent cavities, surrounded by millions of tons of solid rock, that the human mind began to map its own existence and project its inner world outward. Deep in the bellies of caves like Altamira and Acane, far beyond the reach of natural sunlight or the howling wind, these communities huddled together. The acoustics of these deep chambers amplified the sound of breathing, the cracking of bones, and the quiet murmurs of a proto-language. The only illumination came from shallow stone lamps, hollowed out and filled with rendered animal fat, burning with a small, flickering, smoky flame. And here, in this absolute, oppressive darkness, surrounded by the terrifying reality of a frozen world, they engaged in an act that was profoundly unnecessary for mere biological survival. They took raw earth pigments, red ochre, yellow limonite, and black manganese, mixed them with saliva, water, and animal fat, and applied them to the rough, curving walls of the rock. They painted massive, soaring murals of the bison, the wild horses, and the aurochs that roamed the freezing steppes high above them. These were not mere decorations or crude sketches. They were anatomical masterworks, capturing the heavy musculature, the dynamic movement, and the sheer physical weight of the megafauna with startling accuracy. Some anthropologists suggest these were hunting magic, attempts to control the food supply. Others see them as spiritual records or shamanic visions. But fundamentally, objectively, they represent the staggering cognitive leap of a species refusing to be reduced to mere survival. By painting the animals on the walls, they were taking the chaotic, lethal, outer world and bringing it under the conceptual control of the human mind. They were leaving a permanent, undeniable mark of their own consciousness upon the unyielding stone, a vibrant declaration of existence in a world of blinding white. The Franco-Cantabrian refuge functioned as a biological and cultural reservoir for millennia, while the rest of the continent lay crushed and silent under miles of ice. A dense, genetically concentrated population endured in this narrow strip of habitable land. They shared complex techniques over the embers of bone-fueled fires. They repaired their specialized tools, and they passed down the hyper-specific, granular knowledge required to stay alive in an environment actively trying to erase them. The unique genetic markers that define the Basque people today, the high frequencies of Rh negative blood and type O blood, were forged, concentrated, and consolidated within this exact crucible of ice and extreme geographic isolation. The universe is, by its very nature, an unimaginably vast, expanding void of absolute zero, a place fundamentally hostile to the fragile, vibrating chemistry of organic life. Yet, huddled deep within the limestone veins of the earth, wrapped heavily in animal skins, and illuminated only by the sputtering, fragile glow of rendered fat, a small, stubborn collective of human beings managed to hold back that infinite cold. First, they had achieved the domestication of the horse, fundamentally altering their relationship with distance, transforming a simple prey animal into a mechanism of unprecedented kinetic energy and tactical speed. Second, they had adopted the heavy, solid wooden wheel, allowing them to construct massive, ox-drawn rolling wagons that carried their shelters, their families, and their entire lives, severing their need to stay tethered to a single river valley or stationary farm. Finally, and perhaps most devastatingly, they had unlocked the elemental metallurgical secrets of bronze. By fusing soft copper with a precise, minimal percentage of tin, they created an alloy of superior, unforgiving hardness. They cast heavy axes, daggers, and spearheads that would not shatter or dull against bone and wood, like the flint tools of old, armed with bronze weaponry, mounted on horseback, and biologically sustained by the mobile calories of massive cattle herds, and a newly acquired genetic mutation, allowing them to digest animal milk into adulthood. The Yamnaya initiated one of the most violent and comprehensive demographic upheavals in the history of the human species as they expanded westward, branching off into cultures known for their distinct cord-impressed pottery and bell-shaped drinking vessels. They did not simply merge peaceably with the existing Neolithic farming populations of Europe. They overwhelmed them with absolute, terrifying totality. The hypermodern science of ancient DNA sequencing allows us to read this prehistoric conquest with chilling mathematical precision. In sterile, positive pressure laboratories today, geneticists extract microscopic amounts of material from the deep, petrous bone of the skull, the densest, hardest piece of the human skeleton, located just behind the inner ear, where fragile DNA chains are preserved, longest against the corrosive, acidic decay of the earth. When they sequence the genomes from this specific time period, they find a massive, sudden, and brutal disruption. Across Central and Western Europe, the paternal lineages, the specific Y chromosomes passed unbroken from father to son, were almost entirely replaced within a span of just a few centuries. The older Neolithic male lineages simply vanish from the fossil record, abruptly replaced by the dominant genetic signature of the steppe herders, a specific haplogroup known to geneticists as R1b. It was a nearly complete rewriting of the continent's biological code, accompanied by the sweeping linguistic erasure of nearly every indigenous spoken language, replacing them all with the sprawling, dominant roots of the Indo-European tongue. Yet, as this overwhelming wave of bronze, horses, and new DNA crashed across the Iberian Peninsula, it encountered the massive, folded limestone barricades of the Western Pyrenees. Here, the story fractures, and the neat, linear narrative of total conquest breaks down. The archaeogenetic data, sequenced specifically from the Basque region, reveals a profound, stubborn, biological anomaly. The sheer, punishing topography of the mountains, the impenetrable, tangled forests of ancient beech and oak, and the relentless, heavy Atlantic rains effectively stripped the steppe nomads of their immense tactical advantages. Their heavy, solid-wheeled wooden wagons could not navigate the sheer, vertical ravines. Their terrifying cavalry could not charge effectively through the dense, blinding undergrowth or up the steep, slippery slopes. While the rest of the Iberian Peninsula saw their genetic makeup radically altered by the newcomers, the Basque ancestors experienced a highly unique, selective genetic bottleneck. They did absorb a fraction of the steppe genetics, primarily taking on the R1b male lineage, which suggests that some level of interaction, trade, or intermarriage inevitably occurred at the softer, more accessible fringes of the mountain range. But they completely, effectively, blocked the overwhelming wholesale population replacement that erased the rest of prehistoric Europe. Crucially, they retained a massive proportion of their maternal, Neolithic, and ancient hunter-gatherer DNA. Their biological fortress held fast, acting as a massive geological filter. They allowed the shock wave of the Bronze Age to pass over them, absorbing only what they needed without losing the core structure of their cellular identity, and most importantly, without surrendering the ancient, isolating syllables of their language, Euskara, which survived deep in the valleys while every other voice on the continent was silenced forever. Human history is so often told as a frantic, forward-rushing narrative of conquerors and conquests, of sweeping, glorious empires, and the relentless, unstoppable march of technological supremacy. We focus our attention on the massive, sweeping tides of migration that redraw the physical maps and forcefully rewrite the cellular makeup of entire continents. We track the spread of the wheel, the forged blade, and the domesticated horse, marveling at the sheer kinetic force of human expansion across the globe. But the microscopic records locked quietly within our blood and deep within our petrous bones whisper a different, much quieter truth. They tell us that survival is not always about moving faster or hitting harder than the advancing storm. Sometimes, the most profound act of endurance a people can commit is simply the refusal to be swept away. It is the quiet, heavy, unrelenting persistence of standing entirely still, deeply rooted in the stone and the rain, watching the great, invisible tides of humanity break violently against the mountains and recede, leaving you exactly where you have always been. By the 3rd century, before the Common Era, the warm, sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean Sea began to witness the rise of a new, highly organized, and mechanically precise human force from the central Italian peninsula, the Roman Republic, and later the sweeping Roman Empire, expanded outward like a slow, heavy, and unstoppable geometric mechanism. Unlike the migrating tribes or nomadic herders of the deep past, the Romans did not simply move through a landscape. They aggressively terraformed it to match the strict, rational architecture of their own minds. They brought the heavy tramp of hobnailed sandals, the relentless, rhythmic striking of iron against stone, and the rigid, linear perfection of paved roads that cut straight through ancient forests and across shifting, untamed rivers. They laid down aqueducts, erected massive amphitheaters, and imposed a complex, rigid system of written law and taxation upon the fragmented, diverse populations they encountered. Their greatest weapon was not merely the short sword or the highly disciplined formations of their legions, but their unparalleled ability to assimilate, to digest, and to entirely overwrite the cultures they enveloped. When the Roman military apparatus turned its heavy gaze toward the Iberian Peninsula, a territory they called Hispania, they encountered a fierce and deeply fragmented mosaic of Celtic and Iberian tribes. The subjugation of this massive landmass was not a swift or peaceful endeavor. It was a grinding, brutal process that spanned nearly 200 years, culminating in the incredibly violent Cantabrian Wars under the Emperor Augustus. The Roman legions systematically crushed the resistance of the highland tribes to the west, erasing their strongholds, enslaving their populations, and forcing the survivors down into the flat plains where they could be easily monitored, taxed, and slowly stripped of their ancestral identities. Across the vast, arid plateaus of central Iberia and the fertile, rolling valleys of Gaul to the north, the native languages and customs began to dissolve, replaced entirely by the dominant administrative machinery of vulgar Latin and Roman civic life. As the Roman roads pushed inexorably toward the shadow of the Western Pyrenees, they encountered the people they recorded in their sprawling, meticulous administrative texts as the Vascones. It is deeply ingrained in the romantic, popularized folklore of the region to imagine that these ancestors of the Basque people survived the Roman era through a campaign of unending, heroic, and bloody guerrilla warfare, striking from the misty crags and retreating into the impenetrable forests, holding off the might of the greatest empire on earth through pure, violent defiance. Historical and archaeological reality, however, paints a remarkably different, far more complex, and profoundly pragmatic picture. The survival of the Basque identity was not born of endless slaughter, but of a cold, highly calculated diplomacy. The Vascones observed the sheer, terrifying industrial and military scale of Rome. They saw the total annihilation of their neighbors, the Astures and the Cantabri, who had chosen the path of absolute, uncompromising resistance. Rather than throw their population into a suicidal war against an empire that could simply replace its fallen legions with thousands more, the leaders of the Vascones chose a different, quieter path to survival. They engaged in a delicate, high-stakes negotiation with the encroaching superpower. The Roman Empire was, fundamentally, a massive, insatiable organism that required constant feeding. It required grain, it required slaves, and above all else, it required raw materials to equip its armies and build its cities. The deep, folded limestone valleys of the Vascones held something the Romans desperately needed: incredibly rich, easily accessible veins of high-quality iron ore, alongside deposits of silver, lead, and copper. In a brilliant stroke of geopolitical pragmatism, the Vascones opened their borders to trade. They allowed Roman engineers and merchants to establish a presence on the fringes of their territory, at the mouth of the Bidasoa River, where the mountains meet the cold waters of the Bay of Biscay. The Romans built the thriving port town of Oyaso. This was not a heavily fortified military garrison designed to suppress a hostile native population. It was a bustling, cosmopolitan hub of commerce, filled with warehouses, thermal baths, and the constant, rhythmic noise of maritime trade. The Vascones themselves worked the deep veins of the earth, extracting the heavy, red-brown iron ore from the karst landscape. Using their ancient knowledge of the stone, they brought the raw metal down from the misty heights and traded it to the Roman merchants in exchange for currency, fine ceramics, wine, and the tacit, unspoken agreement of political autonomy. They provided the raw material that forged the swords of the empire, and in return, the empire allowed them to keep their mountains. Furthermore, the Vascones offered another highly valuable commodity to the Roman war machine: human capital. Historical records and ancient inscriptions found far across the European continent reveal that cohorts of Vasconic warriors served as highly specialized auxiliary troops within the Roman army. These men, born into the steep, oxygen-thin altitudes and trained to navigate treacherous, uneven terrain, were deployed by Rome to police the frontiers of the empire, from the cold, rain-swept borders of Britannia to the heavily fortified lines along the Rhine River. They fought under the banner of the eagle. They learned the Latin commands, and they absorbed the military discipline of the legions. When their 25 years of mandated service were complete, those who survived were granted full Roman citizenship, a highly coveted status that offered profound legal and economic protections. They returned to their deep valleys in the Pyrenees, not as conquered subjects, but as wealthy, respected veterans, carrying Roman coins, Roman technology, and Roman political leverage. They built comfortable villas on the lower slopes, incorporating underfloor heating and mosaic floors, seamlessly blending the comforts of the empire with the ancient rhythms of their homeland. They became a buffer state, a loyal, heavily armed, and economically vital ally that secured the vital mountain passes connecting the Iberian Peninsula to the rest of Europe. Because of this strategic, highly profitable alliance, Rome never felt the need to execute the brutal policies of forced assimilation that it applied to the rest of its conquered territories. There was no widespread confiscation of land in the deep interior of the Basque country. There was no forced relocation of the population. While the Roman administrators and the Vasconic elite conversed in Latin at the bustling port of Oyaso, or in the administrative centers on the plains, the language of the hearth, the language of the high pastures, and the language of the deep, isolated farming hamlets remained entirely untouched. Across the rest of France and Spain, the native Celtic and Iberian tongues were slowly, methodically starved of oxygen. They were replaced by the language of the courts, the markets, and the law, evolving over centuries into modern French, Spanish, and Catalan. But in the shadowed, rain-drenched valleys of the Vascones, Euskara continued to vibrate through the damp air. The language, isolate, survived not because its speakers built an impenetrable wall of spears, but because they rendered themselves too valuable to destroy and too compliant to bother conquering. They mastered the art of existing within the machinery of the empire without allowing its gears to crush their fundamental identity. Centuries slowly turned, and the immense, supposedly eternal Roman Empire began to crack under the weight of its own massive scale. The bureaucratic machinery rusted, the economy faltered, and the legions were slowly withdrawn from the distant frontiers to defend an increasingly vulnerable capital. The magnificent paved roads began to choke with weeds, the aqueducts ran dry, and the port of Oyaso eventually silted up and fell into quiet ruin. The great wave of Latin culture that had completely submerged the rest of Western Europe began to recede into the Dark Ages. Yet, as the Roman world crumbled into dust and memory, the Vascones remained exactly where they had always been. They watched the imperial administrators pack their scrolls and depart. They watched the trading ships disappear from the horizon, and they quietly returned to the slow, ancient rhythms of the mountain seasons. They had played the greatest empire in human history against its own vast appetites, trading the cold, hard iron of the earth for the right to simply be left alone. There is a profound, subtle power in the refusal to be swept up in the grand, noisy dramas of history. The rise and fall of great civilizations are often measured in the volume of their conquests, the height of their monuments, and the sheer, aggressive noise of their expansion. But true endurance often requires a different kind of strength. It is the diplomacy of silence, the quiet, unyielding pragmatism of knowing when to bend, when to trade, and when to simply allow the heavy, fleeting shadows of great empires to pass over you, leaving the deep, ancient stone beneath completely unchanged. By the late 8th century, the fractured, chaotic ruins of the Western Roman world had been violently hammered back together under the heavy, ironclad rule of a single, colossal figure. In the year 778, the Frankish King Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, commanded an empire that stretched from the cold, gray shores of the North Sea to the sun-bleached plains of Italy. His military machine was a terrifying, thunderous mechanism of thousands of mounted knights, heavily armored infantry, and massive, lumbering baggage trains that devoured the resources of the continent as they marched. This army was not merely a fighting force. It was a mobile city of leather, steel, and muscle, projecting an aura of absolute, unquestionable invincibility. When Charlemagne turned his vast, sweeping ambitions southward, across the formidable barrier of the Pyrenees, into the Iberian Peninsula, he fully expected to extend the borders of his Christian empire into the fractured territories of Al-Andalus. The campaign, however, dissolved into a frustrating, grinding stalemate before the immense, fortified walls of Zaragoza. Exhausted, depleted of supplies, and facing political unrest back in the heart of his empire, Charlemagne made the heavy, begrudging decision to order a full retreat. The massive Frankish host slowly turned its immense bulk northward, beginning the long, agonizing march back toward the safety of the Frankish heartland. As they approached the foothills of the Western Pyrenees, passing through the ancestral territory of the Basque people, Charlemagne committed a profound and fatal strategic miscalculation. Fearing that the fortified city of Pamplona might serve as a base for future rebellions or harbor his enemies after he departed, he ordered his engineers to systematically dismantle its ancient, defensive walls. The Franks tore down the stone fortifications, leaving the city naked and vulnerable to the harsh elements and the shifting political tides of the Dark Ages. It was a calculated act of military pragmatism for the retreating king, but for the Basque inhabitants of the region, it was an intolerable, deeply personal desecration of their ancestral stronghold. As the Frankish army continued its slow, heavy trudge into the ascending, forested slopes of the Pyrenees, a profound, chilling silence fell over the deep valleys. The local population did not assemble a formal army. They did not blow trumpets or display silken banners. They simply melted into the thick, damp canopy of the ancient beech and oak forests, their movements entirely masked by the familiar, shadowy labyrinth of their high-altitude home. The route back into Francia required navigating a treacherous, incredibly narrow geographical choke point known as the Pass of Roncevaux. This was not a broad, paved Roman highway. It was a steep, suffocatingly tight ascending trail, walled in by sheer, vertical rock faces on one side and plunging, dark ravines on the other. For a massive, heavily armored army stretching for miles, the pass was a physical nightmare. The Frankish vanguard, led by Charlemagne himself, managed to push through the highest crests and descend into the safer, wider valleys of Aquitaine. But the heavily laden baggage train, carrying the immense wealth looted from the Iberian campaign, the critical supplies, and the weary, trailing rearguard, was stretched dangerously thin, laboring blindly upward into the deepest, most isolated stretch of the gorge. Among the commanders of this vulnerable rearguard was Ruedland, the lord of the Breton marches, a man whose name would eventually be immortalized as Roland, as his heavily armored cavalry and foot soldiers struggled up the muddy, rutted incline, their chainmail heavy with cold mountain sweat, and their horses exhausted from the incline. They were entirely unaware of the thousands of eyes watching them from the dense, misty tree line above. The Basque Highlanders had positioned themselves with the cold, mathematical precision of apex predators. They wore no heavy metal armor to encumber their movements. They were dressed in the light, woven wool and leather of the mountains, carrying short, lethal javelins, deeply curved knives, and the most devastating weapon available to them, the raw, crushing power of gravity. The ambush did not begin with a cinematic clash of swords. It began with a sudden, terrifying sound of the mountain itself tearing apart. From the invisible heights above, the Basques unleashed a torrential, devastating rain of massive boulders and sharpened wooden trunks, sending them crashing down the steep, V-shaped walls of the ravine directly into the tightly packed ranks of the Frankish rearguard. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. The heavy Frankish cavalry, renowned for their devastating, organized charges on the open plains of Europe, were completely paralyzed, their massive war horses panicked, slipping on the steep, bloody mud, crushing their own riders as the narrow path dissolved into a chaotic, screaming bottleneck. Before the surviving Franks could even raise their heavy, iron-rimmed shields or form a defensive line, the Highlanders descended from the trees like shadows. This was not a battle of honorable, face-to-face combat. It was a methodical, hyper-efficient execution. The Basques used the suffocating terrain to their absolute advantage, darting between the terrified horses, slipping their short blades through the gaps in the Frankish armor, and instantly vanishing back into the dense ferns and the heavy mountain fog before a counterattack could be mounted. The heavy, cumbersome weapons of the Empire were entirely useless in the tight, claustrophobic crush of the ravine. The entire rearguard, including Roland and the highest-ranking nobles of the Frankish court, was systematically dismantled and annihilated down to the very last man. By the time the sun set over the jagged peaks, painting the limestone ridges in deep, bruising shades of violet and gray, the gorge was entirely silent, save for the sound of the wind through the pines and the dying breaths of the Empire's greatest warriors. The Basque fighters effortlessly looted the immense, shattered baggage train, stripping the dead of their valuable iron, their Frankish silver, and their fine textiles. Under the cover of the encroaching darkness, carrying the vast wealth of Charlemagne's failed campaign, they dispersed. They dissolved back into the deep, inaccessible valleys, leaving absolutely no trace of their identity, no forward camps to counterattack, and no leaders to interrogate. When Charlemagne finally realized his rear guard had been severed and marched his vanguard back up the pass the following morning, he found only the stripped, silent corpses of his men, lying in the freezing mud of a nameless mountain road. The enemy had simply evaporated into the mist. It was a brilliant, brutally effective display of asymmetrical warfare, a stark demonstration of how deeply adapted indigenous knowledge and the raw mechanics of geography can shatter the most powerful military machine on the planet. Yet, the human mind is often deeply uncomfortable with the cold, unromantic truth of such a defeat. Over the passing centuries, the agonizing humiliation of the Frankish Empire at Roncesvalles Pass was slowly, carefully metabolized by the culture of medieval Europe. The objective reality of the event, a highly successful, pragmatic ambush by indigenous mountain dwellers, was entirely overwritten. In the great, echoing dining halls of French castles and across the sprawling routes of medieval pilgrimage, troubadours began to sing a fundamentally different story. They composed the Chanson de Roland, an epic, sweeping poem that transformed the grim, muddy slaughter in the Pyrenees into a glorious, cosmic struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. In this meticulously constructed myth, the Basques were completely erased from the narrative. They were replaced by a massive, fictitious army of hundreds of thousands of Saracens, transforming a local territorial dispute into a grand, holy war. Roland was elevated from a competent border lord to a superhuman martyr, blowing his massive, ivory horn so hard that his temples burst, dying a beautiful, poetic death upon a grassy hill, surrounded by the bodies of his mythical foes. This romanticized fiction spread across the continent like wildfire, becoming the foundational epic of French literature and the ultimate model for the medieval code of chivalry. The true architects of the ambush, the pragmatic, lightly armed Highlanders who had defended their ancient borders with devastating efficiency, were relegated to a historical footnote, their true faces hidden behind the towering, glittering facade of an imperial legend. It is a profound testament to the fragile, incredibly malleable nature of the stories we tell ourselves. We take the messy, chaotic, and often brutal realities of human survival and carefully sculpt them into sweeping, comfortable monuments of bronze and poetry. We erase the uncomfortable details. We amplify the heroism of the fallen, and we let the objective truth slip quietly into the dark. But beneath the layers of epic poetry, beneath the ink of illuminated manuscripts and the fading echoes of medieval songs, the physical earth remains entirely indifferent to our fictions. The steep, forested ravines of the Pyrenees still hold the deep, quiet silence of that 8th century evening, entirely undisturbed by the myths of men, standing as the only true, unblinking witnesses to the slow, heavy turning of time. As the centuries folded heavily over the high peaks of the Pyrenees, the descendants of the ancient stoneworkers and pragmatic iron miners began to turn their gaze downward. They followed the steep, rushing rivers that cut through the dark limestone ravines, tracing the cold, fresh water until it spilled out into the turbulent, freezing, and infinitely restless expanse of the Bay of Biscay. The ocean is a fundamentally different wilderness than the mountain. It offers no hiding places, no solid ground to hold against an encroaching empire, and no sheltering, damp canopy of ancient oak to hide beneath. It is a vast, rolling void of crushing physical pressure, sudden, violent atmospheric shifts, and absolute, lightless depths. Yet, driven by the exact same quiet, unyielding instinct for survival that had kept their bloodlines intact through the last glacial maximum and the sprawling mechanical advance of the Roman legions, the Basque people stepped off the jagged edge of the European continent and entered a new, terrifying arena of human endurance. By the 11th century, the tight, clustered coastal villages of the Basque country were no longer merely subsistence fishing outposts. They had evolved into highly organized, hyper-focused industrial hubs. Their entire societal machinery was directed toward the pursuit of the largest biological organisms the Earth has ever produced. The cold waters of the North Atlantic were home to massive, slow-moving, migratory populations of the Balena mysticetus and the Eubulina glacialis, the bowhead and the North Atlantic right whale. These leviathans, weighing up to 80 tons and stretching over 50 feet in length, were moving mountains of dense muscle, thick bone, and incredibly valuable blubber. They were termed the right whales by early hunters simply because they possessed a precise, fatal combination of biological traits that made them huntable with early medieval technology. They swam slowly, grazing on microscopic copepods near the ocean surface. They hugged the jagged coastlines during their seasonal migrations, and crucially, their massive bodies contained such an immense volume of oil-rich fat that they floated upon the surface after being killed, rather than sinking into the inaccessible dark. The Basque transformation into the world's very first commercial whalers was a masterclass in elemental engineering, utilizing the exact resources their geographical fortress provided to conquer the water. They harvested the massive, deeply rooted oak trees that clung to the rainy slopes of the mountains, bending the green, heavy wood, using precise applications of heat and moisture to form the curving skeletal ribs of their ships from the deep subterranean veins of iron they had once traded to the Romans. Their master blacksmiths forged heavy anchors, sharp, barbed harpoons, and thick, rust-resistant nails. They constructed a highly specific, perfectly calibrated vessel known as the Texalupa. This was a sleek, incredibly fast, and maneuverable wooden rowboat, perfectly shaped to slice through the heavy, gray ocean swells with minimal drag. The mechanics of this early medieval whaling were visceral, terrifying, and profoundly intimate. High above the sheer coastal cliffs, stone watchtowers called atalayas were erected, manned by lookouts staring into the freezing wind. When a lookout spotted the distinct, V-shaped mist of a right whale's exhalation blooming violently against the gray horizon, a warning drum was beaten, and the men of the village sprinted down the steep cobblestones to the harbor, launching the fragile Texalupas into the freezing, crashing surf. 6 men would row with exhaustive, rhythmic, muscular precision. They pushed their thin, wooden shell directly into the path of a creature that could obliterate them, reducing their boat to splinters and their bodies to the deep, with a single, reflexive flick of its massive, barnacle-encrusted tail. The harpooner, standing perfectly balanced in the rocking, violently pitching prow of the boat, did not rely on gunpowder, compressed air, or complex machinery. He relied entirely on raw, human shoulder strength and precise timing, hurling a heavy iron shaft deep into the thick, rubbery, unyielding hide of the Leviathan. What followed was a terrifying display of raw, kinetic physics. The struck whale would sound, diving desperately into the dark, freezing depths in a panic, pulling the small boat along the surface of the ocean at terrifying speeds, tethered only by a single, smoking, heavily tensioned coil of thick hemp rope. The men sat in absolute silence, completely at the mercy of the bleeding, panicked giant beneath them, waiting for it to exhaust the oxygen in its massive lungs and return to the surface. It was a brutal, exhausting war of attrition fought on a wildly unstable, liquid battlefield. Once the animal finally succumbed, its massive carcass was painstakingly towed back to the shore. The blubber was stripped using long, curving blades and rendered in massive, roaring copper cauldrons over beach fires. This intense thermal process transformed the thick, white fat into a clear, golden, incredibly valuable liquid known as cyan. This Basque whale oil became the premier fuel of medieval Europe, illuminating the soaring stone cathedrals of France, the damp, drafty castles of England, and the sprawling, dark, cobblestone streets of continental cities. However, the coastal populations of the right whale hunted relentlessly and efficiently for generations, inevitably began to collapse. As the waters of the Bay of Biscay grew empty, quiet, and economically barren, the Basque mariners did not abandon their massive copper cauldrons, nor did they let their meticulously crafted tixalupas rot on the shingle beaches. Instead, they pushed the boundaries of their cartography outward, leaving the comforting sight of solid land entirely behind. They scaled up their shipbuilding, constructing massive, deep-hulled galleons and naus, heavily timbered, floating wooden fortresses capable of carrying hundreds of massive oak barrels, tons of salted hardtack, and giant vats of fresh water and apple cider to stave off the rot of scurvy. Using rudimentary astrolabes to measure the angle of the sun, reading the subtle, shifting positions of the stars, and relying on an intimate, deeply internalized understanding of the complex Atlantic currents, they navigated the terrifying, open void of the Western Ocean. Decades before the celebrated, heavily documented, and politically financed voyages of Christopher Columbus, and more than a century before the English established their starving, struggling, rudimentary colonies at Jamestown and Plymouth, the Basque whalers had already established a massive, highly efficient industrial presence on the freezing, jagged, sub-Arctic coasts of North America. By the early 1500s, they were crossing the Atlantic every single spring in fleets of dozens of heavy ships, navigating the treacherous, iceberg-choked, fog-bound waters of the Labrador Sea to arrive at a vast, wild land they simply called Terra Nova, the new land known today as Newfoundland. In sheltered, deep-water inlets like Red Bay, along the freezing, treacherous Strait of Belle Isle, they constructed vast, seasonal factories. They built stone rendering ovens along the rocky beaches, large cooperages to assemble thousands of watertight oak barrels, and long, heavy wooden docks, literally bringing the heavy, smoking industry of the Pyrenees to the absolute edge of the unknown wilderness. During the short, intense, violently beautiful summer months, thousands of Basque men lived, worked, bled, and died on these desolate shores, hunting the massive bowhead whales that migrated steadily through the icy straits. It is here, on the very fringe of the mapped world, that another extraordinary, unwritten chapter of human pragmatism and quiet survival unfolded. The Basque mariners were not aristocratic explorers, acting on the mandate of a conquering, expansionist monarch. They were businessmen, laborers, carpenters, and sailors, deeply unconcerned with claiming political territory, planting flags, or subjugating native populations. When they encountered the indigenous peoples of the region, the Innu, the Beothuk, and the Mi'kmaq, they engaged in the exact same quiet, transactional diplomacy their ancestors had used with the Roman Empire. The Basques needed peaceful shores to render their oil without the threat of ambush, and they highly desired the rich, warm pelts of beaver, fox, and marten that the indigenous hunters possessed. To facilitate this complex, vital exchange, a remarkable, invisible, linguistic bridge was built across an impossible cultural divide. The indigenous Algonquian tribes and the Basque sailors organically developed a functional, hybridized trade language, a completely unique pidgin that totally bypassed the dominant colonial tongues of French and English that would later drown the continent. It was a language forged in the cold, salt-sprayed air over bartered iron axes and dried fish, combining the ancient, isolated syllables of Euskara with a deep, indigenous vocabulary of the North American forests. An Innu hunter might greet a Basque sailor using a highly specific phrase that seamlessly wove the ancient, stone-rooted words of the Pyrenees with the cadence of the Labrador coast. It was a temporary, floating architecture of human communication, born of pure, mutual necessity, allowing two entirely alien worlds to conduct complex negotiations and coexist in a landscape of unimaginable harshness, operating completely outside the official, violent, heavily recorded narratives of the colonial era. When the bitter autumn wind shifted, bringing the first heavy snows, and the ocean bays began to freeze solid, the Basques loaded their heavy galleons with thousands of barrels of liquid gold and sailed back toward the sunrise, leaving the icy shores entirely silent until the ice broke the following spring. They kept their incredibly lucrative transatlantic routes a fiercely guarded commercial secret, quietly fueling the economies of Europe from the shadows of a world the rest of the continent barely knew existed. We look out at the deep ocean today, and we see a charted, heavily mapped, and mathematically understood volume of water. We track warm currents with orbiting satellites. We map the abyssal plains with multi-beam sonar, and we reduce the terrifying, infinite scale of the sea to glowing, manageable pixels on a screen. But to stand on a creaking wooden deck in the 16th century, feeling the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the freezing ocean, swell constantly moving beneath your feet, with thousands of miles of black water in absolutely every direction, and nothing but the fragile, vibrating iron needle of a compass to guide you, was to step directly into the jaws of the infinite. It is a profound, humbling reminder of the staggering resilience of the human spirit, facing the absolute, crushing darkness of the deep. Surrounded by monsters of unfathomable size, in the cold, indifferent power of the sea, they did not cower on the shore. They simply built stronger boats, cast their thin hemp lines out into the dark, and quietly set about the heavy, terrifying work of lighting the world. As the salt-stained, heavy oak galleons that once chased the Leviathans across the black Atlantic slowly rotted into the cold mud of forgotten harbors, the relentless, invisible wheel of the centuries turned inward. The deep, rhythmic breathing of the ocean tides was slowly replaced by a new, more rigid vibration echoing through the limestone ravines of the Pyrenees. The dawn of the 19th century did not arrive in these isolated valleys with the sudden, violent clash of a foreign invasion, but rather with the slow, creeping pressure of political modernization and the heavy, metallic scent of impending industry. For thousands of years, the survival of this ancient people had been predicated on their physical isolation, protected by the steep, rain-slicked mountain passes that kept the sweeping empires of the continent at a manageable distance. But the modern era is fundamentally intolerant of isolation. It is an epoch defined by the centralization of power, the drawing of strict, uniform borders, and the desire to pull every remote forest, every high pasture, and every isolated human life into the geometric, predictable grid of the nation-state. To understand the profound friction that was about to tear across this landscape, one must look at the invisible, deeply rooted architecture of Basque society, a system of traditional laws and customs known as the fueros. These were not simply a set of administrative rules drafted by a distant monarch. They were the codified memory of the mountains themselves. The fueros represented an ancient, organic social contract, forged over centuries of communal survival in a harsh, unforgiving environment. They guaranteed a profound degree of local autonomy, exempting the Basque provinces from the heavy taxation and the forced military conscriptions of the broader Spanish kingdom. They established a system of universal nobility among the native inhabitants, an egalitarian concept that rejected the rigid, feudal hierarchies of the rest of Europe, asserting that simply being born to the ancient bloodline in these specific valleys made a person free and equal to any lord. For centuries, even the absolute monarchs of Castile recognized this unique status, traveling to the damp, green heart of the Basque country to stand bareheaded beneath the sweeping branches of the ancient oak tree of Guernica, swearing a solemn oath to uphold and protect these ancestral rights. By the 1830s, however, the political center of gravity in Madrid had shifted dramatically. The architects of the newly modernizing Spanish state sought to streamline their chaotic, fractured territory, attempting to impose a single, uniform constitution, a single system of taxation, and a single, unified legal code upon the entire Iberian Peninsula. For the rural, deeply traditional populations of the Basque country, this centralizing force was not perceived as the march of enlightened progress. It was viewed as an existential threat, a deliberate mechanism designed to erase their ancient liberties and dissolve their unique, unyielding identity into the vast, homogeneous machinery of the state. This irreconcilable tension ignited the Carlist Wars, a series of bitter, grinding, and deeply complex civil conflicts that bled across the 19th century. These were not the romanticized battles of medieval knights. They were wars of painful attrition, fought in the freezing mud, the dense, blinding fogs, and the narrow, treacherous passes of the high country. The Basque Highlanders fiercely defended their fueros, utilizing their intimate, microscopic knowledge of the terrain to repeatedly frustrate and exhaust the larger, conventionally organized armies of the central government, echoing the exact same defensive mechanics their ancestors had used against the Romans and the Franks. Yet, the ultimate disruption of the Basque fortress did not come from the muzzle of a musket or the stroke of a politician's pen. It came from the deep, silent chemistry of the earth itself, colliding violently with the insatiable, roaring hunger of the European Industrial Revolution. Deep beneath the rolling green hills surrounding the estuary of the Nervion River, near the medieval merchant town of Bilbao, lay massive, staggering deposits of a highly specific, exceptionally pure iron ore, known as hematite. As the engineers of Britain and Northern Europe perfected the Bessemer process, a revolutionary metallurgical technique that allowed for the mass production of cheap, high-quality steel, they discovered that their new, massive converters required an iron ore entirely free of phosphorus. The geological lottery of the planet had placed one of the largest, most accessible reserves of non-phosphoric iron ore in the world, directly beneath the ancestral lands of the Basque people. Almost overnight, the quiet, rain-swept valleys were torn open. The earth, which had been gently tilled by Neolithic farmers and carefully, selectively mined by the Vascones, was now subjected to a terrifying, massive scale of industrial excavation. British capital, steam-powered excavators, and vast networks of iron railways transformed the green, folded landscape into a sprawling, terraced amphitheater of red dust and exposed rock. The quiet estuary of Bilbao exploded into a chaotic, terrifying, and magnificent metropolis of kinetic energy and thermodynamic power. Massive blast furnaces were erected along the banks of the river, their towering smokestacks vomiting thick, black clouds of coal soot into the damp Atlantic air, entirely blotting out the pale northern sun. The night sky was continuously illuminated by the apocalyptic orange glow of molten iron pouring from the crucibles. The sound of the wind through the ancient beech forests was entirely drowned out by the deafening, rhythmic, and unending concussions of massive drop forges, the shrieking of steam whistles, and the heavy, grinding gears of the shipyards constructing the massive iron-hulled freighters needed to carry the ore across the sea. To feed this colossal, roaring machinery, a massive, unprecedented wave of human migration flooded into the region. Tens of thousands of impoverished, desperate laborers traveled from the arid, sun-baked plains of central and southern Spain, drawn by the promise of steady, back-breaking wages in the mines and the foundries. They poured into the hastily constructed, fiercely crowded, and deeply unsanitary tenement buildings that clung to the steep hillsides overlooking the factories. For the very first time in its unimaginably long history, the isolated, heavily protected biological fortress of the Basque people was breached not by a conquering army, but by the sheer, overwhelming demographic gravity of industrial capitalism. The ancient, unyielding bloodline, which had successfully blocked the genetic wave of the Bronze Age steppe herders and survived the heavy assimilation of the Roman Empire, was suddenly thrust into the crowded, soot-stained, and deeply fractured reality of the modern urban sprawl in the narrow, darkened streets of Bilbao. The ancient language of Euskara found itself suddenly overwhelmed. It was a language mathematically calibrated over millennia to describe the behavior of the wind over the high pastures, the subtle shifting of the ocean currents, and the precise, lithic techniques of the Stone Age. It struggled to find the vocabulary for steam turbines, complex financial derivatives, and the sprawling, mechanized bureaucracy of the 19th century. A profound, deeply unsettling schism opened within the society. On one side, the rural, deeply traditional farming hamlets continued to cling stubbornly to the slow, seasonal rhythms of the Basque and the fading memory of their ancient fueros. On the other side, a new, incredibly wealthy, industrial elite emerged from the smoke, seamlessly blending their ancient, local lineage with the massive, global power of modern finance, steel, and shipping. The land of the oldest blood in Europe had fundamentally transformed, its deep, quiet history permanently interwoven with the deafening noise of the machine age. As the towering smokestacks cast their long, heavy shadows across the ancient, folded valleys, they illuminated a quiet, enduring tragedy of human existence. We are creatures inextricably bound to the environments that shape us, carrying the microscopic memories of glaciers and deep ocean voyages within the very architecture of our cells. Yet, we are also the architects of our own disruption, constantly inventing massive, complex mechanisms that force us to abandon the quiet safety of the past. There is a profound, unresolvable friction that occurs when the unyielding, heavy weight of ancient memory is forced to grind against the relentless, mechanical, and entirely indifferent forward march of the modern clock, leaving us to wonder what essential, fragile parts of the human soul are silently crushed beneath the turning of the gears. Far removed from the roaring blast furnaces, the heavy, iron-hulled freighters, and the soot-stained skies of the 19th century Industrial Revolution, there exists a fundamentally different kind of excavation. In the pristine, heavily filtered, and temperature-controlled environments of modern genetics laboratories, the air does not smell of burning coal or pulverized limestone. It carries the faint, sterile scent of ozone and purified ethanol. Here, under the quiet, steady hum of supercomputing clusters and the precise mechanical whir of massive centrifuges, scientists are not digging through the heavy layers of the earth. They are navigating an invisible, unimaginably complex labyrinth of biological data. They are reading the microscopic, molecular text that dictates the very architecture of human life. When the focus of this hyper-modern analytical machinery is turned upon the descendants of the deep Pyrenean valleys, the resulting data provides a staggering mathematical confirmation of a profound historical isolation. To truly comprehend the nature of the Basque blood anomaly, one must shift perspective, leaving behind the massive, sweeping scale of mountain ranges and deep oceans, and zoom continuously inward, past the boundaries of the skin, down into the microscopic, flowing rivers of the circulatory system. Within a single, suspended drop of human blood, millions of erythrocytes, red blood cells, drift in a pale, nutrient-rich fluid. The surface of these microscopic, biconcave discs is not smooth. It is a dense, heavily forested landscape of complex proteins and carbohydrate chains extending outward from the cell membrane. These microscopic structures are antigens, biological markers that the body's immune system uses to distinguish its own fundamental tissue from a foreign, potentially lethal invader. In the vast majority of human populations across the globe, these cellular surfaces are decorated with specific molecular attachments that classify the blood into type A or type B. However, among the Basque people, there is an overwhelmingly dominant frequency of the O blood type. In the rigid, precise language of hematology, type O is defined by an absence. It is a blood cell that simply lacks the terminal sugar molecules that create the A and B antigens. Its surface is fundamentally stripped down, a smoother, older, and deeply foundational cellular architecture. But the true, baffling mystery of the Basque genome lies in another, entirely separate structural marker known as the rhesus factor, or the RHD antigen. This specific protein, coded by a gene located on the short arm of the first human chromosome, weaves itself intimately through the lipid bilayer of the red blood cell. If your genetic code contains the instructions to build this protein, you are Rh positive. If you are Rh negative, it is not because you possess a different, mutated variation of the protein. It is because you possess a total genetic deletion. The microscopic instruction manual is simply missing a page. Across the broader European continent, this specific genetic deletion is found in roughly 15 to 16% of the population. Yet, as one travels deeper into the steep, rain-shadowed valleys of the Basque country, moving further away from the ancient Roman roads and the bustling, modern industrial ports, the frequency of this microscopic absence climbs to staggering heights. In the most remote, historically isolated farming hamlets, the concentration of Rh-negative blood soars beyond 30%, the highest recorded frequency of this specific genetic trait anywhere on the planet. This profound biological anomaly was not created by magic, nor does it require sweeping pseudo-scientific theories of extraterrestrial origins or lost mythical continents. It is the cold, objective, and beautifully elegant result of pure population mechanics operating within a closed geographical system. In the study of evolutionary biology, there is a powerful, silent force known as genetic drift. Imagine a massive, endlessly shifting ocean of genetic diversity, representing the broader human species. When a tiny, isolated subset of that massive population is separated from the whole, funneled into a geographic sanctuary to survive the crushing ice sheets of the Paleolithic era, and subsequently trapped behind a formidable wall of jagged limestone in an incomprehensible language, they become a biological island. Within this isolated sanctuary, the random fluctuations of genetic inheritance are drastically amplified. If the original founding members of this isolated group happen to carry a slightly higher proportion of the Rh negative deletion simply by random chance, that microscopic trait begins to echo louder and louder with every passing generation. This is known as the founder effect, because the steep, treacherous ravines and the dense, blinding fogs of the Pyrenees successfully deterred the massive, sweeping migrations of the Bronze Age steppe herders and the heavy demographic assimilation of the Roman Empire. The Basque gene pool rarely received an influx of new, diluting genetic material. The ancient water was simply recycled, generation after generation, century after century. This deep geological isolation was further compounded by a rigid, deeply ingrained cultural mechanism, endogamy. For thousands of years, the social architecture of the Basque people was firmly anchored to the Baceri, the ancestral, heavy-timbered stone farmhouse. Strict, unyielding inheritance laws dictated that the land could not be divided, tying families to the exact same plot of rocky, rain-swept soil for hundreds of years. Consequently, people married their neighbors. They married within their specific, isolated valley, and they married strictly within the protective, invisible boundaries of their unique, ancient language. This hyper-localized marriage network acted as a cultural padlock, firmly sealing the biological isolation that the mountains had initially created. It guaranteed that the rare, ancient genetic frequencies of the Ice Age survivors were not swallowed and erased by the massive, shifting populations of the surrounding continent. In the modern era, high-throughput DNA sequencing allows us to read far beyond the simple structural markers of blood types. Geneticists can now unspool and analyze the entirety of the autosomal DNA, the 3 billion base pairs of adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine that constitute the complete human genome. When this staggering volume of biological data is mapped and compared against the genetic signatures of ancient excavated skeletons from across Europe, the true, objective identity of the Basque people is finally brought into sharp, undeniable focus. The data conclusively proves that they are not a separate, disconnected branch of humanity. They are, in fact, the most deeply, fundamentally European population in existence. Their genome is a pristine, uninterrupted biological continuum. It is a perfectly preserved, microscopic snapshot of what the genetic landscape of Western Europe looked like thousands of years ago. A complex, ancient blending of the original Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who survived the deep freeze of the Franco-Cantabrian refuge, and the early Neolithic farmers who slowly carried the seeds of wheat and barley from the east, while the rest of the European map was violently erased and biologically rewritten by the sweeping, horse-mounted invasions of the Bronze Age. The Basque genome remained safely locked away within its mountain fortress. They are the continent's biological control group, a living, breathing baseline of a vanished world. We are so profoundly accustomed to searching for history in the vast external environment. We dig through layers of compacted mud to find shattered fragments of Roman pottery. We scuba dive into the crushing dark of the ocean to measure the rotting timber of sunken galleons, and we translate the fading, brittle ink of medieval manuscripts, hoping to catch a fleeting glimpse of who we were and the desperate struggles we survived. Yet, the most accurate, uncompromising, and enduring historical document ever created does not exist in a museum display case or an archaeological trench. It is folded infinitely inward, coiled tightly within the microscopic nucleus of our own cells. The human body is a vast, living archive, carrying the exact, unbroken molecular memory of glacial winters, ancient stone tools, and the quiet, unyielding endurance of countless generations, passing a silent message of survival across the terrifying, incomprehensible abyss of deep time. Tonight, as the heavy, moisture-laden clouds roll in off the dark, churning expanse of the Bay of Biscay, they release their rain over a landscape that is fundamentally transformed, yet microscopically identical to its deep, prehistoric past. The water falls indiscriminately from the quiet night sky. It washes over the slick, black asphalt of modern highways that wind like ribbons through the steep, narrow ravines. It streaks the tempered glass windows of high-speed commuter trains sliding silently through the mountains, and it sinks deep into the ancient, porous limestone, feeding the hidden subterranean rivers just as it did 20,000 years ago. In the quiet, glowing apartments of San Sebastian, in the hills above the industrial estuary of Bilbao, the night is illuminated not by the sputtering, smoky, animal fat lamps of the Paleolithic caves, but by the cold, precise, blue light of millions of digital screens. The modern air is threaded with invisible frequencies, carrying data, global finance, and instant wireless communication across the planet at the speed of light. Yet, beneath the sprawling fiber optic cables, beneath the steel suspension bridges, and beneath the heavy concrete foundations of this hyper-connected 21st century, the deep biological rhythm of the oldest blood in Europe continues to beat in the chests of those sitting peacefully in the glow of the modern dark. To type a simple text message or write a complex line of software code in Euskara today is to engage in one of the most profound chronological paradoxes in human existence. When a teenager in Navarre taps the smooth glass of their smartphone to send the word for knife or axe, the silicon processors are instantly digitizing a phonetic schwasel. The underlying mathematical structure of this language isolate the ancient ergative absolute grammar that prioritizes the quiet state of existence over the exertion of blunt force, has seamlessly adapted to the architecture of the internet, a language that was meticulously crafted by early human minds to describe those subtle, freezing shifts in wind over the high pastures, the exact, percussive techniques of napping flint, and the heavy behavior of migratory megafauna is now being used to navigate artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and the vast, sprawling architecture of global digital networks. It is a staggering testament to the elasticity and the unyielding endurance of the human mind. The voices that echoed in the absolute, crushing darkness of the Ice Age caves did not fade into the howling winds of prehistory. They simply carried their ancient, stone-rooted vocabulary forward, step by step, century by century, allowing the exact breath of the ancestors to vibrate continuously through the copper wires and silicon chips of the modern era. Consider for a moment the sheer, staggering scale of the planet as it hangs quietly, suspended in the absolute, freezing vacuum of space. The Earth is a massive, rotating sphere of molten iron and cooling silicate rock, wrapped in a microscopically thin, fragile membrane of breathable atmosphere. On the surface of this spinning globe, entire continents have drifted apart. Colossal mountain ranges have been pushed up into the stratosphere and eroded back down to fine sand, and countless biological species have blossomed into existence, only to be systematically erased by the indifferent mechanics of the cosmos. Against this terrifying, infinite backdrop, human history is often nothing more than a brief, sudden flash of kinetic static. We are an incredibly young, deeply fragile species, constantly migrating across the landmasses, constantly displacing one another, and constantly overwriting our own past in a desperate, frantic race for survival. Yet, in one specific, infinitesimally small coordinate on the surface of this rotating sphere, the narrative of constant displacement and complete erasure simply stops. When we pull back and view the entire sprawling tapestry of human history on the European continent, the sheer improbability of this unbroken chain becomes almost overwhelming to the rational mind. We can look back and see the terrifying 2-mile-high walls of the Fennoscandian ice sheet grinding the northern world to dust, forcing the fragile, shivering remnants of humanity to huddle in the geothermal warmth of the deep, karst caves, painting their vibrant defiance onto the unyielding rock. We see the massive, sweeping demographic tides of the Neolithic farmers arriving from the sun-drenched east, slowly blending their seeds, their livestock, and their blood with the indigenous mountain dwellers. We watch the terrifying, unstoppable wave of Bronze Age steppe herders, armed with newly forged metal and mounted on horseback, entirely rewriting the paternal genetic code of Western Europe, only to break, shatter, and recede against the steep, rain-slicked, impenetrable walls of the Pyrenees. We observe the vast, geometric, heavily militarized machinery of the Roman Empire terraforming the land, laying down perfectly straight roads and trading their imperial wealth for iron, yet failing completely to extinguish the isolated syllables spoken in the high, misty valleys. We hear the chaotic clash of Charlemagne's heavy cavalry, the greatest military force of the Dark Ages, violently shattered by gravity and guerrilla precision in the claustrophobic choke point of Roncevaux Pass. We track the heavy, salt-stained oak galleons pushing off the edge of the known, mapped world, navigating the freezing, monstrous, lightless void of the North Atlantic to hunt 80-ton leviathans in the dark, building invisible bridges of language with indigenous hunters on the other side of the planet. And we witness the deafening, earth-tearing roar of the Industrial Revolution, burying the ancient green hills under millions of tons of coal soot and slag, attempting to pull a profoundly isolated people into the frantic, homogeneous, heavily taxed grid of the modern nation-state. Through all of this immense, chaotic, kinetic energy, through the rise and violent fall of absolute monarchs, the slow shifting of tectonic plates, the rewriting of global DNA, and the relentless, crushing, invisible weight of time, The geographic and biological fortress held. The mountains did not move. The blood remained deeply, fundamentally unchanged. The human lineage residing in this specific, jagged fold of the earth simply watched the great, noisy dramas of history pass over them like the heavy, gray weather rolling off the sea. They adapted without breaking. They absorbed the necessary technologies of the outside world without dissolving their core identity. They stand today as a quiet, living monument to the profound power of standing absolutely still, deeply rooted in the heavy earth, while the rest of the world rushes frantically and blindly toward the horizon. The human body is indeed a living archive, and the text written within the veins of the Basque people is a story of magnificent, unyielding endurance. And now, as the night deepens and the heavy rain continues its slow, rhythmic descent upon the ancient stone, it is time to let the long, sweeping timelines of history blur and fade. Let the images of the deep, glacial ice, the galloping horses of the steppe, the perfectly paved Roman roads, and the heavy, creaking wooden ships dissolve quietly into the dark. You do not need to hold on to any of the science, the genetics, or the heavy centuries we have traversed. You do not need to remember the microscopic molecular structure of the blood, the tectonic forces of the earth, or the ancient syllables of a forgotten world. You can simply let it all wash away, leaving only the steady, comfortable rhythm of your own breathing in the quiet of the night. If you're still awake and you've enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, you can gently tap the like button or subscribe. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. Rest well